Open the pod bay doors, Tom.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away.
46, 56 degrees.
Well, it's my honor to be a part of this very useful program. I think that we all owe a debt to those who have organized the program, who've been involved for these 30 years. And my presentation is in two parts. The first part is to tell you a little bit about the movie. It's imaginative. It has excellent actors and actresses, and it's a little scary. The second part is reality, because I'm impressed in my experience in infectious diseases that much of it is like theater. The theater in development of new antibiotics, in vaccines, in the clinical trials that are extensive in getting to the biologic truth, and in contrast to the science fiction of the epidemic that takes place in the movie, I want to describe a number of recent pandemics that have been, to my way of thinking, including a theatrical component. As example, and I'll go through the four of them quickly. The first is a Middle East respiratory pandemic that started in Saudi Arabia and was transmitted to the first individuals from camels. So that's a unique feature. The second was a important epidemic that started in China, went into Hong Kong, had a high fatality rate, and had a number of ill individuals in Canada because of the transportation between Hong Kong and Toronto in particular. Then following the ones that you may be more identified with in knowing about, and that's the Ebola experience. And some of the issues about our response to the Ebola outbreak that included very strict quarantines that led to some problems in this country. And then finally, the Lyca virus and the terrible tragedy that has occurred among the infants who were born having suffered in utero that infection. So let's talk about the movie first. As you can see, there's a terrific cast. Mira Sorvino, Josh Brolin, F. Murray Abraham. And this is, without giving it away, this is pretty much the beginning of the story. Science discover a cure for a deadly disease, and there's much acclaim. But 3 years later, their creation has mutated and mimics and destroys everything in its path, including man. So much of the movie is devoted to, can this mimicking, mutating event be stopped? So that's the story. Now I go on to the first issue, and that is relatively extraordinary. I don't know of another pandemic that is started by transmission of a virus from camels. And the first individuals who were infected were camel drivers and others who took care of camels. And this evolved to several thousand individuals with a high mortality rate of 10 or 12%, and extension of the pandemic to be inclusive of Europe and all of the Middle East countries, and in total about 34 countries, including several cases in the United States. As of this past June, there were some 2,000 cases of a virus infection that was transmitted initially from camels called a coronavirus. Now, the second pandemic was even more interesting and dramatic enough to be the subject of a movie with Gwyneth Paltrow called Contagion. It started in China and involved bats, and the bats found their way into chicken coops. The chicken coops were the subject of food to some of the large hotels, and a number of people in the Hong Kong area were infected. And again, there was a mortality rate of about 5 to 10%. With a large number of Asian who had migrated to Toronto, was a problem in terms of the long flight time and the chance for there to be spread of the infection. So there were more than 800 cases in the Toronto area alone. A coronavirus mortality rate was about a third. So again, a very serious event, and now seems to be under control with identification of the transmission routes. So this was called the SARS syndrome. Like the Middle East respiratory syndrome, it was a coronavirus, but a different serotype. Now, one that is more recent and that had severe consequences in Central Africa was our Ebola. And the issue that I wanted to cite was once it had been identified that even small amounts of blood and vomitus could be transmission to susceptible individuals, it was a severe and rather drastic quarantine of the individuals who had been in contact with any patients who had Ebola virus. At our hospital, there was double gloving, double gowning. Fortunately, we didn't have any cases, but you may recall that you were asked the question at every time you entered the hospital about whether you had been in any of those areas in Central Africa which had experienced the Ebola virus. The quarantine issue was one that was familiar to me because it was one of our former residents who got into trouble in breaking her quarantine. It was Nancy Snyderman. Some of you may recall Nancy was an ENT resident and then became a correspondent with NBC News, went to Africa, came back well, but the cameraman came down with Ebola disease. And since she had been in contact with that individual, she was placed under 30 days quarantine. She could not leave the house during that period of time, but she needed food, went to the grocery store, was identified as a recent individual in Ebola contact, and she was placed under arrest. So she was under house arrest and was not a happy camper. Then finally, our current issue of the Zika virus. And the Zika virus uniquely destroys fetal tissue, and you are familiar with the pictures of a baby with microcephaly, with most of the cortex destroyed, and undoubtedly a poor quality of life during most of the years that the baby will survive. The interesting thing about this experience with the Zika virus is that it had been present and identified in Central Africa since 1947. It was a mild febrile disease, occasionally with rash, but very little in the way of severe morbidity. And for reasons unknown, there was a mutation. And several of these pandemics did arise from a mutation in the initiating virus. transmitted to Brazil initially, identification of microcephaly in these babies, and even among the areas in Brazil, there were different incidence rates of this phenomena of microcephaly. What it appears to be in recent animal data is a mutation, and a mutation that arose and differentiated the mild disease from this phenomena of microcephaly. I've been involved in fetal and newborn infection for some time, and there's no phenomena like this. This is a new entity with such dire consequences. Aedes aegypti is the transmitting arthropod, and in addition to the Zika virus, during the period of time that it's been transmitted throughout South America and Central America, it's accompanied by chikungunya virus and dengue virus. So the three are close together causing mischief, and this is a presentation in the Clinical Infectious Disease Journal that identifies an early study of, well, that was the last slide. And it identifies that in Nicaragua, and I'm not sure about the community, Peter, but you say there's been very few cases in the past year. And that's fortunate because we're seeing cases now even in Florida and Texas with pregnant women and about a 10% attack rate of microcephaly. So the movie, it'll be enjoyable, and I wanted to tell you about my experience in the theater of these pandemics with camels through the Middle East, with the problems in Hong Kong and transmitted to Toronto, the Ebola experience, and finally, this dreadful mutation causing microcephaly. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight, and I hope you'll enjoy the movie.